Hey guys and girls, I'm the Crazy Critter Guy, and this creature is an Amphiuma. Although if you've ever encountered them personally, you might know it as the SGBT, the slimy gray bitey thing. It's actually a salamander, and as long as you don't want a pet that's all warm and fuzzy and loves to snuggle, well then this one here makes a pretty awesome creature for your collection. And today we're going to clean his cage, and I'm also going to show you some tips and tricks on how to keep these things happy and healthy. So, a little bit more about these creatures before we get started. In the wild, Amphiumas are often mistaken for eels or snakes, but like I said, they're actually a salamander, which is an amphibian. We have 3 different kinds that live in the United States, and each one has tiny little legs, and their name is based on the number of toes they have on each foot, either 1, 2, or 3. Ours is called Lieutenant Neptune, and she is a 3-toed Amphiuma. These critters are found primarily in the southeastern United States, and they're almost fully aquatic, although they can sometimes be found sliding through the mud or across roads in rainy conditions. They prefer low, swampy areas with lots of vegetation, like overgrown ditches, and that's where they hunt for their prey. Things like crayfish, worms, frogs, and really anything they can catch and stuff in their mouth. And trust me, they have a voracious feeding response. How do I know, you ask? Well, let's just say that I'll post a link of when I let Lieutenant Neptune bite me, purely for science, of course, and then you'll be able to see for yourself. Today, we're going to clean her cage. Are you ready to start? Now I've turned the video to vertical so you can get a full view of the tank as I do this. Her home is a 70-gallon heavy-duty tank that was originally built to house turtles, and the first thing we're going to do is remove the driftwood. If you're going to raise one of these creatures, one of the key features to keeping them happy and healthy is to duplicate as much as possible their natural environment. And that can present some problems, the main one being how to keep a foot of mud on the bottom of the aquarium and still keep the aquarium clean. And the answer is, you can't. Trust me when I say that there isn't a filter out there that will adequately, or even remotely, come close to cleaning water in a tank with a foot of mud on the bottom. And so, tip number 1 is pretty simple, and that is you don't need to keep these things on a mud bottom. Now remember, these things can bite hard, and they're not venomous, but you should use extreme caution anytime you're dealing with them. For most people, I recommend using a large mesh net to safely transfer them. She's more curious right now about what's happening to her environment, but we do need to get her out of here in order to clean her tank. And there's another problem that we're going to have to deal with, which I'll get to a little bit later. Now remember, you don't need to keep them on a mud bottom, but you do need to recreate their habitat as much as possible. And that means things like plants and driftwood, and places to hide, all of which should be geared to the size of the Amphiuma. When we first got Lieutenant Neptune at our nature center, she was about 24 inches long, and her favorite hiding place was a section of 2-inch diameter PVC pipe that was as long as she was. PVC pipe can make a good hiding place for these creatures, but just make sure that you sand the sharp edges so your Amphiuma doesn't get hurt when it slides into the pipe. Lieutenant Neptune is now 37 inches long, and she's so thick that she won't fit inside of a 2-inch pipe, so she just hides in the plants and driftwood. We're transferring her into the plastic container, and to make her feel more comfortable, I'm going to keep a couple of her aquarium plants with her. Now the reason we're doing this is tip number 2. I've worked with all kinds of animals for over 30 years now, and if I had to boil down all of my experience into one statement, it would be this: do your best to not stress out your animals. So we're going to keep her with a little bit of a familiar taste of home while her tank is cleaned. Okay, we've removed Lieutenant Neptune from the tank, and now it's time to clear everything else out. Amphiumas, like most amphibians, are fairly sensitive to pollution in their environment. You generally will not find them in water with high contamination levels. The mesh bag that you're seeing is part of the filtration process for the tank, and we'll talk about it a little more in just a few minutes. Some people keep Amphiumas in tanks without any filtration, and it is possible to do that, but you'll need to be much more active in monitoring the water chemistry, and you'll need to change the water more frequently. I prefer to have supplemental filtration, but even with a filter, you still need to monitor the chemistry and do water changes. Lieutenant Neptune's water is changed twice a month. The first time I do a 50% water change, which is a simple way of saying I remove half of the water that's in the tank and replace it with new water. She stays in the tank while I do this. 2 weeks later is when we totally strip the tank and replace all the water like we're doing today. Now we come to tip number 3, and that is find ways to make taking care of your Amphiuma both easier and more efficient. Whether you take care of animals as part of your actual job, like I do, or if you just do it as a hobby because you think they're really cool. Either way, find some shortcuts or ways to make the things that you have to do go smoother. Let's face it, cleaning cages and doing water changes can get a little monotonous, but it needs to be done, so make it as painless as possible. This little gizmo here is a submersible utility pump. I'll put the link to it down below, and it's been a game changer for me. You don't have to use one of these, but it just makes life so much easier. It will drain the water down to about 1/4 inch, and it attaches to a standard garden hose. Once you get near the bottom, take a net and scoop up as much of the solid waste as you can. Yep, you're scooping poop. Yuck. The utility pump can move small bits of solid waste, and if it ever does clog up, it's easy to backwash. So now we want to spray off the inside of the tank and remove the rest of the water. Some people use a standard spray nozzle for a garden hose. That works, but I like one of these little things a little bit better. It's just a splitter that will allow you to divide a single garden hose into two. I find that I am less likely to accidentally spray myself in the face with one of these things, and in my experience, they seem to not leak as much as a spray nozzle, which if you're dragging the hose through your mom's house, I'm sure she'll appreciate as well. Okay, we've got most of the water out of the tank. That little bit that's left over won't hurt anything, and now it's time to go to the sink. At the sink, the first thing we're going to do is clean the internal filter. Because we keep the water in Lieutenant Neptune's tank only about 8 inches deep, you can't really use a typical aquarium filter, and you really don't want to, which brings us to tip number 4, and that is know your creature. Remember, these things like to live in habitats with shallow, slow-moving water, like swamps. And while we could hook up a filter that would clean the water more efficiently, it would do that at the cost of changing the water flow rate in the tank. So this little internal filter gives us a happy medium. It helps to clean the water, which we want, but it doesn't turn the tank into Class 4 whitewater, which Lieutenant Neptune would not like. Oh my goodness, we are already at tip number 5, and it's a good one. Quite simply, tip number 5 is find ways to do things better and cheaper. This filter originally came with a flimsy foam insert that would clog up in less than a day. I replaced that insert with giant chunks of scrubby pad that I cut to fit. Where can you get these? Usually at stores like Home Depot and Lowe's. They're made for floor buffing machines, and you can get them in both round and square. Different colors signify the different coarseness of the pads. I design and build most of my own filters for the displays here in our Wildlife Center, and these pads are worth their weight in gold. I'll put a link down below. There's a lot of different kinds of internal filters available, and most of them have a removable basket. I use this one to hold a mixture of ammonia-absorbing chips and activated carbon. Amphiumas process a good amount of waste, and you want to do your best to keep their water chemistry safe. Make sure that you always rinse the basket before you put it back into the filter. So now we'll take a few minutes to reassemble the filter. Our next step is squirting off the plants. We'll make sure that we clean the ones that are with her in the plastic box before they go back in as well. This thing here is a heavy-duty mesh media bag. We're going to replace the contents before we put it back into the tank. Having an additional way to purify the water is always a good thing, especially when you're dealing with a creature the size of an Amphiuma. Personally, I like to use the large chunks of activated charcoal instead of the small chips. There's less chance of them getting caught up in the filter, and for whatever reason they seem to keep my water chemistry more stable. I'll put a link to them in the section below. I fill the bag about 1/3 full with the activated charcoal, but now it's time for tip number 6. Charcoal does not dissolve ever. And what's that saying about an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure? So, buy one of these little drain screens and use it anytime you're working over a sink. It's a lot better than having to tear apart your plumbing because it was clogged up with gravel, flakes of turtle shell, and chunks of activated charcoal. Yep, been there, done that. The next third of the bag gets filled with the same mixture of ammonia-absorbing chips and activated charcoal that we used in the internal filter basket. As always, make sure you rinse well. I replace the contents of this mesh bag every other time I do a total water change, so about every 2 months. And you can see what would have been down your drain. Now it's time to squirt off the driftwood. Unless you have a giant sink, outside is probably the best bet. I got this driftwood about 10 years ago from a river not too far away. It's got a nice hollow curve, and Lieutenant Neptune likes to rest underneath it. Time for tip number 7. Make sure you decontaminate any driftwood that you want to use in your Amphiuma habitat. If it's small enough, you can boil it. If it's larger pieces like this, it's best to soak it in a plastic tub with a bleach water solution for several days. Just make sure that you also take the time to soak it through several changes of clean water after you're done. So now we're back to the tank and ready to refill the water. It's pretty simple. Just turn the hose on and wait. Time for tip number 8, which is kind of related to tip number 5 about saving money, but let me phrase it like this. The more money you save, the more creatures you can get. You've probably seen this stuff before. You've probably used this stuff or something similar. Basically, it removes the chlorine and a few other things from the tap water to make it safer for your fish, or in this case, your Amphiuma. But did you know they make a concentrated version designed for use in fish ponds? It's the same stuff, only a little goes a lot further. I tend to use more than a required dose when I do a full tank water change, and if you do a lot of water changes, you will save tons of money by using the pond version of this stuff. I'll add it to the links below. So, as the water continues to fill, we'll put the driftwood back and then add the filter. Sometimes you have to purge the air before it will run, and always remember to have it totally underwater before you plug it in. Now, you know what time it is, right? It's safety tip time. This one will be a freebie though. Remember, when you're working with water, there's a good chance your hands will be wet. Make sure that you dry your hands thoroughly before you start plugging things like, filters into the electrical outlet. True fact. Einstein used to have perfectly straight hair until he plugged his Amphiuma filter in with wet hands. Don't be an Einstein. Our media bag and plants are going in next, and that means it's time for tip number 9. Now, live plants are great, but they don't last, and that can get kind of expensive. Plastic plants will last a lot longer, but they don't really feel like natural vegetation. So tip number 9 is to find yourself some silk aquarium plants. They're soft. They're not super cheap, but they'll last for a long, long time. Do you remember way back when we were taking Lieutenant Neptune out of the tank and I told you there was another problem we were going to have to deal with? Well, here it is. Lieutenant Neptune's tank is unheated, but the Nature Center is climate controlled and kept about 72 degrees. So the water in her tank stays about 72. The problem is our water supply, which is cold water only at the moment. As you can see, the water we refilled her tank with is hovering about 57 degrees. She, however, is still sitting in that tub full of 72 degree water. If we were to just plop her inside, that would be a 15 degree instantaneous drop. Remember tip number 2 about not stressing your animals? So, make sure you give your Amphiuma time to acclimate to the new environment. In general, amphibians can handle cool temperatures fairly well, but the sudden change is something you want to avoid. Okay, it's a little bit over an hour later, and the water temperature in her box has been equalizing to the new water in her tank. We can help it along even further by gently adding a few cups of water from the tank to balance the difference. It's time to release her, and that means she gets to enjoy her freshly clean environment. But I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Lieutenant Neptune only has 3 legs. She's missing her front right leg. That's the way she came to us, and we think it gives her an extra bit of character. So now we do a final check of the filter to make sure it's running, and then we're ready for tip number 10, which is Amphiumas are awesome creatures. And not only are they awesome, they're pretty interesting as well. Did you know that an Amphiuma has 25 times the DNA that a person does? Or that they can live for over 20 years in captivity? Or how about that they have the largest red blood cells of any animal? And finally, for a slime-covered swamp dweller, they're pretty darn cute and photogenic. Don't forget to check out the video of her biting me. It's pretty cool. And if you have any questions about Amphiumas, post them in the comments below. And as always, make sure that you like and subscribe to this channel for more upcoming videos. Have a great day, and thanks for watching Walking on the Wild Side with the Crazy Critter Guy.